Hey American literature friends, this is a short video under the terminology section. It's going to go through the Southern Renaissance. The Southern Renaissance is a reinvigoration of writing in the American South. It started in the 1920s after World War I, carried through the 1950s, and even into the early 1960s. You know, by the time you get to the early 1960s, Flannery O'Connor from Georgia has died. William Faulkner from Mississippi has died. The traditional Southern Renaissance has ended by the late 1950s, early 1960s. Before the Southern Renaissance, and especially in the 1890s, 1900s, and 19-teens, the Southern writing had focused on the Old South, the pre-Civil War South, the South of slavery, and the heroism. And it had really romanticized that time period and made the people of that time period seem like heroes, and the history and the morality and the lost cause of the South in the Civil War, and this sort of romanticization of this world that was, for those people, sadly dying. But Renaissance writers challenged all of that and focused instead on history and defeat as a burden, the losing of the Civil War, the problems of slavery and racial issues. Prior to World War I in the 1920s, 90+% of African Americans in the United States lived in the South. So that sort of interaction between African Americans and the residents of the South is important, because before the Harlem Renaissance and World War I, that is where most African Americans in the United States lived. And on the complexities of place, family, religion, and identity in this very conservative, very religious, and typically with very few exceptions, rural area. There are very few cities in the South up until the 20th century, and even up until the second half of the 20th century. You know, prior to World War I, the population of Atlanta was only 10 or 12,000, and really the only cities in the South were Charleston on the Atlantic Ocean and New Orleans on the Gulf of Mexico, both big port cities, because those were really the only cities that the South had prior to this sort of surge that began in the 1920s and 1930s, when things like air conditioning and electricity began to come to the South. William Faulkner is sort of the king of the Southern Renaissance, but there's a bunch of other important Southern Renaissance writers like Eudora Welty, also from Mississippi, Flannery O'Connor from Georgia. Dig a little deeper into that. You got Thomas Wolfe from North Carolina, Margaret Mitchell from Atlanta, most famous for most of us for Going with the Wind, Carolyn Gordon, Catherine Ann Porter, Erskine Caldwell, also from Georgia, Alan Tate from Tennessee, often associated with Nashville, Tennessee Williams, Robert Penn Warren, whose most famous book is All the King's Men, and Zora Neale Hurston, who's originally from who's born in Alabama, but traditionally associated with like Central Florida and the area around Orlando. Like I said, before the Renaissance, Southern writers tended to focus on historical romances about the lost cause of the Confederate States. The best example I can give you of that sort of lost cause mythology comes from the early 1900s. And the first full-length movie that we have in the United States, which is Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation is a 1915 silent movie, and you can see the movie poster right here and what it's glorifying. Birth of a Nation is very much this lost cause. Birth of a Nation, the first half of it celebrates that antebellum pre-Civil War South and mythologizes and romanticizes it. And then the second half celebrates the rise of the Ku Klux Klan after the Civil War as this sort of force that brought law and order back to the South after the chaos of the Civil War. So you can see that it is deep into that mythologizing of the Old South that Southern Renaissance writers wanted to attack and take apart and take down. And the Birth of a Nation is based on a book by Thomas Dixon called The Klansman, which is very clearly a good example of that pre-Southern Renaissance mythologizing of the Old South. The Southern Renaissance writers came along and were like, that's all silly. That's a totally false representation of the South before the Civil War and the conditions in the South of the Civil War. It's totally false, it's totally silly, it's absurd. And Southern writers were really trying to to give a much more realistic, less romanticized depiction of not only the race relations in the American South, but basic conditions of people. The belief in heroism and morality of the South's lost cause is a driving force between the Civil War and World War I. Again, that time period of the 1860s into the 19 teens. The Southern Renaissance addressed three major themes in their works. The first was the burden of history in a place where many people still remembered slavery, Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877, and that devastating military defeat. The South never really did not really recover from the Civil War up until the 1890s, and the Spanish-American War in the 1898 is often seen as this event that helped reunite the country. So it took from 1865 into the 1890s for the United States to really feel sort of healed and unified, or even the beginning of that process. The second theme was to focus on the South's very conservative culture. Up until the 21st century, the South has traditionally been the most conservative part of the country, and specifically on how an individual could exist without losing a sense of personal identity in a region where family and religion and community were more highly valued than one person's personal and social life. And the final theme is that the Renaissance writers' approach was the South's troubled history in regards to racial issues, as I was talking about. Obviously, because more than 90% of African Americans lived in the South, and the South had this deeply troubled history of slavery, and then Reconstruction and the rise of the first Ku Klux Klan, and then the Jim Crow era, which began in the 1890s and continued all through the Southern Renaissance. Southern Renaissance writers were trying to wrestle with all of those issues in a much more realistic, much more fair-minded way. And as it says right here, among Southern Renaissance writers, William Faulkner is arguably the most influential and famous because he won the Nobel Prize in Literature. But there are many Southern Renaissance writers from all over the South: North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia. Zora Neale Hurston from Florida. So every state that's arguably even the South has some writer represented in the Southern Renaissance. Hopefully that gives you a good introduction, or at least some places to begin thinking about the Southern Renaissance. Like I said, the Southern Renaissance really began to wind down after World War II, and then by the time you get to the early 1960s, it's very clearly over. As I said, by the time you get to the early 1960s, Faulkner is dead, Flannery O'Connor is dead, and the conditions and situations that created the Southern Renaissance have largely changed, or at least begun to change. You know, you get the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement in 1954, and then the Civil Rights Act that gets passed in 1964. And so many of the conditions of the Southern Renaissance have, if they're not completely gone, they have very clearly begun to change or evolve. Hopefully, like I said, that gives you at least an introductory understanding of the Southern Renaissance. If you've got more questions or want to dig deeper into it, let me know and I'll be happy to help you do that. Otherwise, thanks for your time on this one.